Arouse in yourselves the highest kind of love, reverence, and serene faith. Renounce the impurities of the hindrances and the defilements and be at peace. Listen to the perfection of wisdom of the gentle ones, set forth for the benefit of all and practiced by the heroic. So I wanted to start with this quote from a relatively new translation of the first part of the Ratnaguna Samchayagata for several reasons. Firstly, it's a call to readiness. It's a call to prepare ourselves for the spiritual life. And as this is the first of our 5 talks on this retreat, in some ways it's a call to all of us to ready ourselves for the journey ahead on this retreat and our spirit into our spiritual lives. Secondly, I really love Shraddhapa's translation of the word Shraddha, which we often render as faith or faith confidence. And I really like the idea of serene faith. And thirdly, I like this quote as it encourages us to listen to the perfection of wisdom of the gentle ones. And I think we need to do more than just listen. We need to really hear their words and develop a deep, serene faith around them. And finally, to really live a spiritual life that's deep in meaning and effective in practice, we need to be heroic. And hopefully over the course of this morning, you'll be introduced to the 5 great spiritual faculties that Bodhisattva spoke about that will enable us to do just that. So the first of these, of course, is faith. And this is what I'm just going to have another slide just to show what I'm going to just cover in my talk. So what do we need faith in? And I'm then going to talk about 3 dimensions of faith: intuitive or emotional, cognitive or critical, and then volitional. And I'm also going to weave in my own personal experience of the emergence and development of faith, and also misplaced faith in my own life, from a worldly and also from a spiritual context. But what is it we need faith in? Well, to start with, we need some sort of belief, some inkling that there's more to life than our current experience. And this is how my journey into Buddhism and Triratna began when I was 17. And it began with that first dimension, the intuitive or emotional dimension of faith. I was probably a typical 17-year-old, not particularly content with my life. And around this time, I was doing a part-time business studies course at Colchester Institute. And on this course, there was a man who was always cheerful. Whatever happened, he never seemed to be fazed, whereas I was pretty much an emotional roller coaster. So I asked him one day why he was so cheerful all the time. And he said it was because he was a Buddhist. A bit skeptical about that. But he then proceeded to invite me to a weekend retreat at Padmaloka, a retreat centre in Norfolk, which I agreed to attend. And it was an incredible experience. I could still remember aspects of that weekend. So from knowing nothing about Buddhism, I learned how to meditate. I experienced ritual and puja, like we'll be doing this evening on this retreat. And I heard some really inspiring talks, which I hope we'll also be experiencing today as well. And it's fair to say that it set in motion a complete change in my life. And there was something about this man that I was drawn to. And for some deep, inexplicable reason, I knew I could trust what he was sharing with me. So after that glimpse, and I imagine we've all experienced this to some extent, otherwise we probably wouldn't be here. After this experience, that initial emergence of this intuitive faith, we start to explore where we can place that faith. And another translation of Shraddha is literally to place the heart upon. And as Buddhists, we would say that where we place our heart is, of course, on the 3 jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So we might start with whether we believe in the Buddha, in what the Buddha attained, the idea of going beyond suffering, of enlightenment. Do we trust, at least to a certain extent, that the Buddha gained enlightenment? Well, for me, I trusted the man who introduced me to the Buddha, and I could see that he believed and had faith. So then we'll turn to the Dharma, the path of the teaching of the Buddha, which, as our threefold puja says, leads from darkness to light. So again, we ask ourselves the question, do we believe that the Buddha, or actually for me, all those decades ago, did I believe that these people that I was associating with at Padmaloka actually have a path, actually have a way out of suffering? Well, whatever it was, the guys I met back in the 80s were following and practicing. It definitely seemed to be working for them. I'll never forget that sense that here was a group of people who wanted to change the world, and they wanted to do this in a very different way from my experience of the world at the time. They wanted to change the world for the better with kindness and with compassion, and it was an extremely liberating and inspiring vision for the 17-year-old version of myself. And I also had my first experience of what I thought was the Sangha, those people practicing the Dharma and following the Buddha's teaching. I'll say more about the Sangha a bit later. And looking back, it feels as if a golden thread was kind of twined around me during that time, and one that I would become reacquainted with many years later. So at the time, this faith was very much based on the intuitive and emotional response. So it may sound to you a bit like blind faith, a faith that isn't backed up by experience. And although this initial intuition may be the beginning of the emergence of faith, really now this needs to be tested using our critical faculties. So nowadays we're very fortunate and can do that rather effectively within Triratna. So we have newcomers courses like the one Kusala Dana is going to be running on Thursdays, where we're introduced to different concepts and models of the Dharma. We have men's and women's group where we can get into deep discussion, Mitra study groups where we can go even deeper into the Dharma, and lots of excellent retreats like the one we're all on right now. So we have plenty of opportunities to question and to challenge, to develop that second dimension of faith, so that our faith can be rooted in investigation and inquiry and not based solely on our intuition and emotional engagement. In the Kalama Sutta, we have the Buddha's famous encouragement of free inquiry, where he gives the instructions to the Kalamas in which he advises them to test things out for themselves. And the first test is to apply our critical and analytical thinking, to investigate, discuss, even challenge. Now, back in the 1980s, Triratna, or FWBO, as it was then, didn't really have the extensive resources that we have now. And my only consistent context for pursuing the path was by regularly visiting Padmaloka. And despite the number of retreats that I was going on, I still had long periods of time where I had no regular contact or opportunity to develop and move from that intuitive faith. Not that I really understood that that's what I needed to do, of course, at the time. But essentially, I failed to progress and move on. So my faith was still there, but it was still emotional and intuitive. And in those days, when you came along to the movement, there were quite rigorous expectations, and some of these were pretty difficult. And without any real sort of support at the time, sometimes they felt quite even severe. And I simply wasn't ready for those challenges. And without any reliable personal resources, I ended up feeling kind of let down by some of those that I'd met at Padmaloka. So I sort of lost a sense of faith in the Sangha, or what I considered to be the Sangha at the time. So I was young, fairly unworldly, pretty inexperienced in life. And I wasn't living with or surrounded by like-minded people. In fact, I was surrounded by activists from the left of politics. So people involved in animal rights, CND, the anti-apartheid movement, and of course the miners' strike in 84, 85. So something spiritual had awoken in me when I went to Padmaloka, but at the same time as something political. And there was a bit of a battle that ensued for my energy, for my attention, and in a way for my life. And as my only real context for Buddhism was by traveling backwards and forwards to Norfolk and Padmaloka, but my political context was all around me, I stepped more fully into the worldly arena. And by the late 1980s, I stopped going to Padmaloka, and I still considered myself a Buddhist and continued to regularly meditate. But I discovered this intuitive faith about politics, which was meeting my strong desire and drive to want to change the world for the better. So, and unlike my intuitive faith in Buddhism, with politics, I could test out my ideas. I was able to move to the next dimension of faith, the cognitive, critical dimension. Plenty of people around me who I could explore the ideas that I was excited by: fairness, equality, women's rights, justice. I spent 3 summers at the Cooperative Party Summer School in St Andrews, just outside Edinburgh, learning how to debate, learning how to argue, and just learning about life. And when I was 27, I moved into the 3rd dimension of faith around politics, the volitional. So I began to put all of this faith into action and set out trying to change the world through politics. So I became an elected councillor when I was 27. I was deputy leader of the district council a year later. I even spent a year as the mayor of Brightlingsea in the year 2000. I went about setting up charities. I became a school governor, put lots of schemes and initiatives in place to help people. And all of this I did whilst I was working my way up through a large corporate organisation, which I joined in 1988. So fast forward a bit, 11 years later, that faith that I'd been putting into action in my life started to crumble. So my political party was in opposition. Many of the things I'd created were being dismantled, and the stress and strain of the life I'd been living finally took its toll. And after a complete emotional breakdown, I eventually admitted that I was an alcoholic. But I was very fortunate, and one of the people who was working directly for me had been sober for nearly 10 years, very gently guided me into sobriety through Alcoholics Anonymous. And for a year, that's all I really focused on. That was back in 2005. So I've not had a drink since then. In fact, Thursday just gone was my 15th anniversary of being sober. And I mentioned the golden thread earlier that I felt was wound around me at Padmaloka. And after about a year of being sober, that golden thread started to pull again. So I was working in India, and I went to an AA convention in Kerala in South India, and it's quite extraordinary. So this is a long story which I haven't got time to tell, but if you're interested in the details, let me know. But essentially I met an order member at this AA convention who I recognised from Padmaloka 25 years previously. So I go all the way to India and bump into an order member. And then 2 days later, as a surprise treat from a Sri Lankan company that we were working with, that I placed a big contract with, as a surprise, they flew me by helicopter to visit the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy, which is a very famous Buddhist site. And again, there's a whole story there. But those 2 events really made me, it just felt like this golden thread was pulling me very firmly back into the path of the Buddha, Dharma and the Sangha. So I came home and almost immediately sought out the Colchester Buddhist Centre, which now existed, which it didn't exist in the 80s. And then I began to go to meditation and then newcomer classes. So my intuitive faith in the 3 jewels, in the Buddha, had been reawakened. And this time, unlike earlier, I could investigate and I could test what I was learning. And very shortly after that, I walked away from all political activism. And that's still the case. And instead, I felt ready to commit to a spiritual path. So I moved into the volitional dimension of faith. And alongside studying the Dharma, I became a Mitra, and I really committed to the Buddhist path with my actions. So I started meditating more. I began refining my ethical behavior, and guess what? My life started to improve. And as my life improved, my faith began to grow. And that faith began to serve as a bit of a spur for my practice. The more I practiced, the more my experiential understanding grew, which of course led to strengthening and deepening of my faith. But the one thing I also did was I thought I'd seek out the man who had first introduced me to the Dharma, who I hadn't seen for many years. So that golden thread of faith led me back towards him and led me to rekindling that friendship, which again helped to strengthen all the dimensions of faith I had in the three jewels. And I also realized at the time that the Sangha jewel is really those enlightened disciples of the Buddha, rather than just the people who happen to turn up at Padmaloka or Colchester Buddhist Centre or Ipswich Buddhist Centre with a passing interest in Buddhism. And I started to learn about the great figures on our refuge tree of inspiration, and my faith in the Sangha jewel really started to grow and to strengthen. But then I started to go on lots of retreats, and I began to meet order members throughout Triratna who had something about them. It was indefinable, and yet it was there. And my faith just continued to grow, and it grew around the idea of being able to transform and develop deeper levels of consciousness in the Dharma as a way of doing this, and in those whom I could see were kind of different. So in 2012, I asked to join the Triratna Buddhist order, and I began training for ordination. And at the time I was still working. My son was 13. And in some respects, I was still holding on to quite a worldly life. And that all changed quite dramatically on a retreat. So be careful doing these retreats. Things can happen. Back in 2015, during a led meditation, and I just realized that I needed to go much further than I'd gone so far. In fact, the phrase that I always think of is I realized I just needed to fall off a cliff. So I came home from that retreat, which was about 3 weeks long, sat down with my family and just told them that I needed to quit my job and my career, which was nearly 30 years. I had no plan. We had some savings, so we thought we'd be okay for a while. I didn't really know what I was going to do. And they were very happy for me to do that, because they saw probably more clearly than I did, I suspect, just how unhappy I'd been in the latter years of my working life, as I changed my outlook on life was conflicting with the corporate values. So holding tight to that golden thread, that's exactly what I did. And what unfolded was some quite big changes in our lifestyle. And after a few failures to get a much lower paid part-time job with very few responsibilities, no one wanted to give me an interview for anything at all, I realized that I had the opportunity to take a much reduced occupational pension, which is what I did. So instead of working again, I just devoted myself, firstly focusing on my ordination and then working for the Dharma. So in 2016, I was ordained at the Gukyaloka Retreat Centre in southern Spain and given the name Sthiranaga, which means the most faithful and true. So I've got a little picture coming up of my public ordination. And some of you will no doubt recognise the man on the left. You're probably more likely to recognise the man on the left than the man on the right, because I didn't have hair in those days. It's of course Arta Priya, who is the president of our Ipswich Centre. And during this 4-month retreat, I was able to look back on my life and just see the incredible difference in where I placed my faith in politics and worldly change, and the difference in where I placed my faith in the three jewels. So whilst I was at Gukyaloka, I wrote this poem. So I'm just going to read out. Golden thread of the Dharma. Spread out my life on the shrine room floor, sifting through poor decisions and choice, tasting emotions painful and raw, chilled to the core by a visceral voice. How on earth have I ended up here? what halted my journey into the abyss, with mind obscured by shadows of fear, an inward obsession I cannot dismiss. How could it be I was wrenched from the deep, steered to the surface by a thread of gold, gently woken from coma-like sleep, heart encouraged to be open and bold. So I sit immersed in deep gratitude, 3 jewels at my heart and hope renewed. And the deepest and most heartfelt gratitude that I will always have will be for the person who first introduced me to Buddhism and Sri Ratna and took me to Padmaloka, and later, very much later, gave me my name. And that, of course, is our very own Bodhisattva. So we're almost finished now, but we're just going to see a little picture of the 3 of us at Padmaloka. So me, Bodhisattva and Artapriya. So in conclusion, I want to thank Bodhisattva for everything he's done for me and for the fact that he's still there for me, he still supports me. And I would encourage you all to become aware of that intuitive faith, test that faith, put that faith into action and see the results for yourself. And the spiritual life is certainly not the easiest life to choose, but in my experience, as my faith has developed, it's certainly the most fulfilling and rewarding life I could possibly imagine. Thank you.